Thank you, Susan. Thank you, all the co-sponsors, staff. And it's great to be back in the Berkshires again and to have this opportunity to talk with you. Thank you for coming tonight. We're going to talk about economics tonight. So let me tell you about my career in economics. It started when I was 10, and my father, who was an actual economist, hired me to crunch numbers for a book that he was writing on the stock market. And I used one of these old Frieden mechanical calculators. You're probably too young to know what they were like. But they were the sort of machine that actually put the crunch in number crunching. I had no idea what the numbers meant, but I had a lot of fun crunching them. So a little later, when I went to college, I thought, well, maybe I have an aptitude for numbers, so I should major in math. Big mistake. It was all way over my head. So I majored in history, and then for the first 13 years after I graduated, I was a journalist. But then, in my mid-30s, I had, one of several midlife crises, and started wondering why I was just writing about what other people were doing, and why shouldn't I do something myself. So I said, okay, I'm going to start a business. In fact, I'm going to start a worker-owned solar energy business. Now, bear in mind that at this time, there was no solar industry. This was the 1970s. I didn't know anything about solar energy, and I didn't know anything about running businesses. So it was a completely mad idea, but I did it, and it worked for 6 years until Reagan became president and abolished the tax incentives for solar energy, which killed the entire industry, including my business. Anyway, so for 20, then when that happened, I started working assets, which many of you know, I hope, and that has morphed into Credo Mobile today. But the reason that I spent 20 years in business was not to get rich. It was to understand from the inside how capitalism worked and how far you could push the boundaries, and how, I'm searching to understand economics by getting inside the beast. That was what was in my head all these years. And during these 20 years, I tried lots of different things. Worker-owned business, socially responsible investing, socially responsible spending. You remember the working assets Visa card. Eventually, I concluded that none of these worthy endeavors, or even all of them put together, would save us from capitalism's two tragic flaws. Capitalism has a bunch of flaws, but the two really tragic ones, in my view, are, one, its relentless destruction of nature, and two, its equally relentless widening of inequality. So, if I wanted to learn how those flaws could be fixed, I had to go back into economics. So I kind of made a return to economics after I retired from business, which was 1995. Now, 19 years later, since I've kind of re-entered economics, I've come to some conclusions, and I want to share them with you tonight. These conclusions can be summed up in 3 sentences, which I'll give you right now, and then I'll elaborate. 1, we're entering a new era in which the current way we run our economy won't work. 2, in this new era, our economy must do 2 things it doesn't do now: operate in harmony with nature and provide an adequate income for everybody. And 3, the best way to achieve these goals that I just mentioned, and when I say best, I mean the way that A will work and B will require the least involvement of government, is to propertize some commonwealth and share the income from that wealth equally. Now, I'll explain in a minute what I mean by propertize commonwealth, so just hang in there. Now, why is this important? It's important because if we do what I'm about to propose, we can have a market economy that does what an economy needs to do in the 21st century. It can be a market system that works for all, including our shrinking middle class, nature, and future generations. We can have the kind of locally rooted economies that many of you are working to build in the Berkshires and elsewhere, economies that will flourish once the global corporate economy is made to pay the costs of using commonwealth, costs that it now does not pay. And that's why it's cheap to buy all that stuff that they mass produce. So the key, just to repeat, the key from getting from here to where we need to be, from our current normal to the new normal, is that we have to think differently about wealth that we share, and we have to organize that wealth in new ways. Okay, let me ask a question now. How many of you have heard the term Anthropocene before? Ooh, that's pretty good. Okay, but some of you haven't. The term refers to the geological era that we are now living in, as opposed to earlier geological eras you may have heard of, the Jurassic, the Cenozoic, and so on. The term was coined in 2000 by a chemist named Paul Crutzen, based on the Greek root for human, anthropos, and what it means is the current human age that we're living in. What distinguishes the Anthropocene from the Holocene, which is the era that began when the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago, is that we humans have become, the dominant geological force on the planet. Our impacts on oceans, forests, freshwater, topsoil, biodiversity, and the atmosphere have been devastating, and they continue getting worse at an accelerating rate. In other words, the human species is out of control. I don't want to diminish our species' accomplishments during the Holocene because they have been momentous. But now that we're in the Anthropocene, we can't continue doing business the way we do it in the Holocene. What's normal today can't be normal tomorrow. We need a new economic normal in which, at a minimum, the two biggest flaws that I previously mentioned are fixed. All right, now we're going to go through a quick tour of at least my journey through economics for the last 19 years. I began this journey by rereading three economic thinkers that many of you will be familiar with: E.F. Schumacher, Henry George, and Thomas Paine. Not your average economists. Schumacher's chief concern was harmonizing our human economy with what he called the meta-economy of nature. I think meta-economy is a great concept. We've got micro, macro, now we need to go to meta. With this in mind, Schumacher encouraged the development of appropriate technologies, worker-owned businesses, and locally rooted economies. In my view, these activities describe the kind of world that we want to get to. But the problem is we can't get there until we stop the juggernaut that's devouring our planet and turning our society into a hugely unequal plutocracy. So, we have to fix those major systemic flaws. Now, Henry George's primary concern, as I'm sure many of you know, was the maldistribution of income. Writing in the 1880s, he asked why poverty continued and even grew as America got richer. And his answer was because of land rent. Land rent, George wrote, was like, and here I'm quoting, an immense wedge being forced, not underneath society, but through society. Those who are above the point of separation are elevated, but those who are below are crushed down. I've never forgotten George's image of rent as a wedge between rich and poor. It accurately described reality in 1880, and it does accurately describe reality today as well if we extend the scope of rent beyond land. But in thinking about George's proposed remedy, a single tax on land, I don't think that's enough. I think we have to go beyond that. And one of the things that is insufficient about it, I think, is that it taxes the rent from land, or it would, and give that money to government, but the government is not necessarily well suited to help those who are on the bottom of that wedge that he was talking about. Then I reread Thomas Paine. Amazingly, since Paine was writing in the 18th century, I found his thinking more relevant to the Anthropocene than anyone else's. Paine's economic thinking is contained in his remarkable essay called Agrarian Justice, which, in spite of the title, isn't really about agriculture, but it is about property rights. And now I'm quoting from Paine. He said, "There are two kinds of property. First, natural property, or that which comes to us from the creator of the universe, such as the earth, air, and water. And secondly, artificial or acquired property, the invention of man. The latter kind of property, the human-invented kind, must necessarily, and here I'm paraphrasing, must necessarily be distributed unequally. But the first kind of property rightfully belongs to everyone equally." And here I'm quoting again, "It is the legitimate birthright of every man and woman, not charity, but a right." Paine's genius was to invent a practical way to distribute income from shared ownership of natural property. Remember, this is 1797. He proposed a national fund to pay every man and woman, roughly in today's money, $17,000 at age 21, and roughly $12,000 a year after age 55. Revenue for this national fund would come from ground rent paid by landowners, and Paine even showed mathematically how this could work. And the second part of that proposal, the money to everybody over 55, was a precursor to Social Security. Presciently, Paine recognized that land, air, and water could be monetized, not just for the benefit of a few, but for the good of all. Further, he saw that this could be done at a national level. This was a remarkable feat of analysis and imagining. Now I want to jump to two other economists who are probably a little less familiar to you, maybe not. One is Arthur Pigou, Pigou, and the other is Ronald Coase, Coase. Pigou was a colleague of Keynes at Cambridge University, And he was the first economist early in the 20th century to focus on the market's failure to include external costs such as pollution. This is the tragic flaw number one that I referred to earlier. The essence of it is that because markets charge nothing for pollution, companies pollute far more than they would if markets charged a substantial price. Pigou's proposed remedy, was for government to estimate the costs that are externalized, let's say the cost of pollution, and tax polluting activities enough to reduce them. So, though this idea, this proposal of Pigou's would work through markets, it isn't entirely a market-based fix because it requires government to calculate these external costs, impose appropriate taxes, and collect them. This presupposes an enlightened government that's able to take actions in timely ways free from the sway of externalizing industries. And that's a supposition that's rather difficult to make these days. Now, Coase was a colleague of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. His breakthrough was to show that markets could set prices for pollution without government. Markets could do this if, and it's a big if, polluters and pollutees had property rights and could bargain with each other easily. If this were the case, they could arrive at an amount and a cost of pollution that was agreeable to both sides, and that would be, there would be less, pollution would cost more, there would be less of it, and we wouldn't need the EPA. So that was Coase's theorem, and he was quite well known for that within the economics profession. And when I read this, it intrigued me. But I saw a few problems with it. First, pollutees, which is all of us, presently have no property rights with regard to ecosystems that are being polluted, and thus we have no power to bargain with polluters. So if Coase's model is to have any practical use, that problem has to be solved. That's the first thing. The second problem in Coase's model is that even if you had the property rights, the agreed amount of pollution would be optimal for the buyers and sellers of pollution rights, because that's what markets do, they optimize buyers and sellers, but it might not be optimal for nature, which isn't included in the bargaining. And the third problem with Coase's model lies in its distributional impacts. One of the key questions Coase avoided was who should pay whom. Should polluters pay us for the right to pollute, or should we pay polluters to pollute less than they currently do? Coase argued that it doesn't matter, that you'd wind up with the same amount of pollution either way. Now this may be true theoretically, but obviously in the real world it makes a huge difference who pays whom. If we have to pay higher prices to polluters, polluting companies will benefit and we will see our living standards fall. On the other hand, if you flip that around, we've got a better outcome. So while thinking about Coase's model and climate change in the early 2000s, I saw a way to fix those three problems that I found in Coase's model. And that was the idea of a sky trust, which I wrote about in the book whose title is Who Owns the Sky? The idea is basically that a trust could be created to hold America's atmospheric pollution rights in trust for future generations and living pollutees equally. Using peer-reviewed science, the trust would decrease its sales of pollution rights over time until a safe level for nature was reached. That's how nature gets into the bargaining here, by the trust setting the supply of pollution rights based on what is needed by nature, not just based on what the market is willing to pay. Meanwhile, revenue from the sales of those pollution rights would be distributed equally to every legal U.S. resident with a Social Security number, offsetting, and in many cases more than offsetting, the impact of higher fuel prices. So that was the idea of the Sky Trust. It was based on the Alaska Permanent Fund, which since the 1980s has been sharing oil-based income with every Alaskan equally. It's a great precedent, the Alaska Permanent Fund. And essentially what I'm arguing, which I'll get to in a minute in my new book, is that we need a national version of the Alaska Permanent Fund that goes beyond oil. I'll get to that in a second. In 2009, the Sky Trust became known as cap and dividend, and there were those bills introduced in Congress as a kind of alternative to cap and trade, but they weren't passed. It's still the best climate change solution out there, and one that Congress is actually starting to revisit. Representative Chris Van Hollen of Maryland is next week actually going to introduce a new cap and dividend bill. It's not going to pass, we know that, but it's good to start the process going again. Let me end this brisk tour of economics now by mentioning a new school of economic thinking based on systems theory. This school is sometimes called complexity economics, and one of its leaders is a man named Eric Beinhocker, who is a director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford. The basic idea of complexity economics is that an economy, like nature, is a complex adaptive system whose outcomes, large-scale outcomes, emerge from the interaction of the agents in the system, and all of these agents follow rules that are internally coded. Like the corporation's internal code says, go out there and maximize your short-term profit. Another tenet of complexity economics is that if a complex system is to remain near equilibrium, its positive and negative feedbacks must be roughly in balance. So any complex system has a lot of feedback going on, and if the positive feedback, which is the kind that amplifies whatever's going on, the negative feedback is the kind that dampens whatever's going on, like a thermostat. If it gets too hot, the thermostat turns it down. They have to balance if a complex system is to keep going in equilibrium. The problem with our current economic system is two things. One, from the point of view of complexity economics, one is that the agent population, which consists mostly of profit maximizing corporation, is way out of balance. And the feedback mechanism are also out of balance. We have too much amplifying feedback, so the rich get richer and everything just keeps going faster, and not enough of the negative feedback. So both of these things are what are these sort of runaway feedback mechanisms and the kind of monoculture of agents that we have, profit maximizing agents, are what essentially cause climate change, wealth concentration, and the decline of our middle class. So that's my quick foray through economics. Let's pull all the pieces together now. My thinking about how to fix those two giant tragic flaws of capitalism is essentially a melange of Paine and Coase and complexity economics. What holds this melange together and makes it work is commonwealth. So let me explain that. Commonwealth, which is wealth that rightfully belongs to all of us together, as distinct from private wealth, comes in tangible and intangible forms. It includes tangible gifts of nature, as Tom Paine said, most particularly our atmosphere and our ecosystems, and intangible human creations such as our financial system. It also includes the value added by complex systems within our economy, which is the emergent value that exceeds the summed value of a system's parts. Consider what would happen if the internet or our power system or our monetary system crashed. The parts of these systems would have very little value standing on their own. It's the whole that creates most of the value of the parts. And that whole belongs to all of us. It's essentially part of the commonwealth. So all of this commonwealth is hugely valuable. We couldn't live without it, and we certainly couldn't have the amazingly productive economy that we now have without it. The problem is that the market doesn't see this commonwealth. It's like the dark matter of the economic universe. And that's what needs to change. We need to make invisible commonwealth visible. The way the market ought to see commonwealth is as wealth we hold in trust for future generations, other species when appropriate, and all living humans equally. Or, as legal scholar Carol Rose has put it, as property on the outside and commons on the inside. For this to happen, commonwealth needs to be embodied in legal entities that the market can see and respect. Outwardly, such entities would, in a way, look like corporations, but inwardly they'd be different. They'd be coded to protect their assets for future generations and to share current income, if there is any, equally. In Capitalism 3.0, my previous book, I call this process of embodying commonwealth in a legal envelope propertization, which may not be the best possible word, but it's the best I could come up with. It should not be confused with privatization, which is the giving or selling of commonwealth to private owners. Propertization keeps commonwealth common, while at the same time protecting it from private takeover. A great example is the Community Land Trust, which you are familiar with. My argument, then, is that propertization of selected pieces of commonwealth, including some very large ones like the atmosphere and the monetary system, if done to scale, can fix capitalism's two tragic flaws. By making invisible commonwealth visible, it can make the invisible hand of the market smarter and fairer. Let me just walk you through this now, flaw by flaw. Flaw number one, the destruction of nature. As we said, it's because the price of nature is zero under the current setup, as is the price of screwing future generations. And so despolation rolls on. As every economist knows, the conceptual solution is to internalize externalities, to make the polluters and the depleters pay today. To do that, the market needs to tell commercial entities, corporations, no externalization without compensation. Got that? The question is how to do that. So, propertizing Commonwealth is a way to do that. Right now, externalities are invisible to markets because there are no economic actors that turn them into prices that externalizers have to pay. But suppose there were. Suppose that the market was populated not just by profit maximizing corporations, but also by what I will generically call Commonwealth trusts. On the outside, these trusts would be to Commonwealth what corporations are to private wealth, chartered legal entities that represent defined interests. Corporations, we know, they represent the interest of shareholders. In the case of Commonwealth trusts, they would represent a combination, which might vary from trust to trust, of nature, future generations, and members of society as a whole. If the market were populated by such trusts, corporations couldn't just shift costs and pay nothing. They'd have to bargain with representatives of nature, future generations, and members of society as a whole. No externalization without compensation would become the rule. This would affect prices throughout the economy and in the process flip the positive feedbacks to negative. Instead of having an incentive to externalize more, corporations would be forced to externalize less. So that would fix flaw number one. Flaw number two, widening inequality. Remember that image of Henry George of rent as the wedge dividing rich from poor. The reason this happens is that the rich have powerful agents on their side, while everybody else has either weak or no agents on their side. And it's simply a fact that in a competitive economic system, a market system, wealth will flow disproportionately to those who have the most powerful rent-collecting agents. But remember those Commonwealth trusts I just talked about to solve the problem of externalities. It turns out they can also have a second function, which is to solve the problem of inequality. They can represent, as Paine said in 1797, these entities could represent all living members of society in the marketplace. When corporations are properly charged for using or depreciating Commonwealth, the trusts can take what's now charged and distribute some or all of the proceeds to all members of the community equally, one person, one share, as Alaska does. If this were done, we'd wind up over time with two parallel systems for distributing income. The highly unequal system based on private wealth that we now have, plus an exactly equal system based on Commonwealth that would run alongside of it. The second system wouldn't entirely eliminate inequality, but the bigger it got, the more it would level things out. So that's the summing up of what I've been thinking, which is kind of represented in the three books that I've written, including my latest, which is called With Liberty and Dividends for All. And the argument that I make there is that our middle class is in a kind of irreversible decline because, thanks to globalization, automation, and the decline of labor unions, there won't, at least in the foreseeable future, be enough good-paying jobs to sustain a large middle class in America. This is an inconvenient truth, but it is the truth, and we have to face it. Though still, if you listen to the politicians, they're yabbering about jobs and jobs and jobs, as if that alone was going to fix everything. The fact is that it can't and it won't. and that if we want to have a large middle class in the future, we have to supplement labor income with non-labor income. Now, if we can accept that premise, then there are two possible ways to create some non-labor income and spread it around. One is to raise taxes on the rich and distribute that revenue to others using some kind of a means test. That's what most liberal, neoliberal people tend to think is the only way you can do it. But the other way is the Tom Paine way, to pay dividends to everybody from wealth we own together. And in my new book, with Liberty and Dividends for All, guess which one I am arguing for? The dividends would come from a nationwide fund similar to what Paine proposed and what Alaska does with its permanent fund. The revenue for the fund would come from a variety of common assets, starting with our atmosphere and our financial system. Over time, its dividends could grow to about $5,000 per person per year. And I'll explain how that could happen. These dividends would not be welfare, but legitimate property income. And they would provide much needed security to our shaky middle class. This form of non-labor income, as opposed to the tax and redistribute approach, is, I think, appealing and almost quintessentially American because it's simple, fair, transparent, inclusive of everyone, direct. In other words, it doesn't wait for some trickle down, which never happens. It's about ownership, not redistribution. It's market-based. It's easy to administer. It can be administered by a computer. And it's transpartisan, I think. It dodges this tension between bigger government, smaller government that has sort of paralyzed us. So I think it could be supported by libertarians as well as progressives. So I want to close by just addressing the question that always comes up when I talk about this. Well, it's a great idea, but how on earth is it going to happen? We know that Washington today is incapable of doing anything, much less fixing the two biggest flaws of capitalism. But let me quote Milton Friedman here. Smart man, right? Won a Nobel Prize. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. Now, if you think back to 2008, we had a big crisis, but there really weren't any ideas lying around, and we wasted that crisis. Nothing came of it. Dodd-Frank is a fraud. The too big to fail banks are bigger than they used to be, and so forth. So we can't waste another crisis. There's surely another crisis coming. It may be financial, it may be ecological, who knows? What we need to do is prepare now for the next crisis by putting ideas like dividends for all, Commonwealth, out there. So they're lying around and our leaders have a way to go. There's also popular pressure. So I want you to work with me on that. I want you to start getting this idea around, okay? Talk about Commonwealth. Start saying, we own the sky. We own our money system. And start organizing around that. If we do that, I think there's at least a chance that after the next crisis, we can fix the fundamental flaws of our economic system, preserve and share Commonwealth, and somehow make it through the Anthropocene. Thank you.